Where have the graves of antiquity's greatest minds vanished? We have Alexander's mausoleum, the sepulchres of pharaohs, the tombs of emperors. But where lies the mortal remains of Aristotle, tutor to kings? Where rests Pythagoras, who heard the music of the spheres? They altered the course of human thought, yet their final resting places seem erased from the face of the earth. These men who mapped the cosmos and decoded the laws of logic have themselves become mysteries, their bones lost to time as surely as their teachings transformed it. Tonight, we descend into one of history's most perplexing enigmas. Why did the graves of these intellectual giants disappear, and can we ever find them? In the shadow of their monumental legacies lies a darker question about memory, power, and the price of immortal wisdom. Historical context. To understand the mystery of the missing tombs, we must first grasp the magnitude of the lives that should have been memorialized within them. These were not merely philosophers scribbling in obscurity, but towering figures whose influence reshaped the ancient world and continues to echo through our modern understanding of reality itself. Pythagoras emerged from the mists of the 6th century BCE like a figure from legend, though his historical reality was no less extraordinary than the myths that surrounded him. Born around 570 BCE on the island of Samos, he lived during one of the most intellectually fertile periods in human history, when the ancient Greek world was awakening to new possibilities of rational thought and systematic inquiry. The man who would become known as the father of mathematical philosophy was shaped by the cosmopolitan currents of his age, traveling extensively throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Ancient sources credit Pythagoras with journeys to Egypt, where he studied with the priests of Memphis and absorbed the mathematical wisdom of a civilization already ancient by Greek standards. He allegedly spent years in Babylon, learning from the mathematical astronomers who had developed sophisticated techniques for calculating celestial movements. Some accounts even suggest he traveled to India, where he may have encountered the spiritual traditions that would later influence his teachings about the transmigration of souls. When Pythagoras finally settled in Croton, a prosperous Greek colony in southern Italy, he brought with him a synthesis of mathematical, mystical, and practical knowledge that was unprecedented in the ancient world. The school he founded around 530 BCE was unlike anything that had existed before, combining rigorous intellectual training with spiritual discipline and communal living. The Pythagoreans, as his followers came to be known, were not merely students but initiates in a mystery tradition that viewed numbers as the fundamental basis of reality. The influence of Pythagorean thought extended far beyond mathematics, though their mathematical discoveries were revolutionary enough. They were the first to provide formal proofs for geometric relationships, to discover the mathematical basis of musical harmony, and to propose that the entire cosmos was structured according to numerical principles. Their famous theorem, while known to earlier civilizations, was transformed by the Pythagoreans into a window into the mathematical nature of existence itself. But the Pythagoreans were more than mathematicians. They were mystics who believed in the immortality and transmigration of souls, ethicists who developed detailed codes of moral conduct, and political theorists who experimented with communistic forms of social organization. Their influence on later Greek philosophy was immense, shaping the thought of Plato and, through him, the entire Western philosophical tradition. The historical record of Pythagoras' final years is fragmentary and contradictory. Some sources place his death in Metapontum, another Greek colony in southern Italy, where he allegedly fled after the violent persecution of his followers in Croton. Others suggest he died in Croton itself, possibly in the very fire that destroyed his school. The date of his death is usually given as around 495 BCE, though some accounts place it as late as 475 BCE. Aristotle, born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a small Greek city in northern Macedonia, entered a world that had already been transformed by the intellectual revolutions of earlier generations. His father, Nicomachus, was court physician to the Macedonian king, giving the young Aristotle early exposure to the practical aspects of scientific inquiry. This background in empirical observation would later distinguish his approach from the more abstract philosophical methods of his predecessors. At the age of 17, Aristotle journeyed to Athens to study at Plato's academy, where he would remain for the next 20 years. During this period, He absorbed the Platonic tradition while simultaneously developing the critical perspective that would eventually lead him to reject many of his teacher's fundamental assumptions. Where Plato saw the material world as a mere shadow of eternal forms, Aristotle would come to view it as the primary reality deserving of careful study and systematic classification. The breadth of Aristotle's intellectual achievements is almost incomprehensible by modern standards. He made fundamental contributions to logic, developing the system of syllogistic reasoning that would dominate Western thought for over 2 millennia. His ethical writings explored the nature of human flourishing and the role of virtue in achieving it. His political philosophy examined the structures of government and the conditions necessary for human communities to thrive. Perhaps most remarkably, Aristotle was also a pioneering natural scientist. His biological works, based on careful observation and dissection, established many of the basic principles of zoology and comparative anatomy. His physics, while ultimately superseded by modern science, represented the first systematic attempt to understand the natural world through reason and observation rather than mythological speculation. The opportunity that would define Aristotle's historical importance came in 343 BCE, when King Philip II of Macedon invited him to serve as tutor to his son, the future Alexander the Great. For several years, Aristotle guided the education of the young prince who would go on to conquer most of the known world. The relationship between teacher and student would profoundly influence both men, with Alexander's conquests spreading Greek culture and learning throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, while Aristotle's later research would be supported by specimens and observations collected during Alexander's campaigns. After Alexander's accession to the throne, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum, in 335 BCE. For the next 12 years, he led what was essentially the first research university in human history, with students and colleagues engaged in systematic investigation across virtually every field of knowledge. The Lyceum became a center of learning that rivaled and eventually surpassed Plato's academy in its influence on ancient thought. The scope of Aristotle's written output during this period was staggering. Ancient sources credit him with over 200 treatises covering subjects ranging from logic and metaphysics to biology and literary criticism. His works were not merely theoretical but were based on extensive empirical research, including the first systematic classification of living organisms and detailed studies of political systems throughout the Greek world. The final chapter of Aristotle's life began in 323 BCE with the death of Alexander the Great. The philosopher's association with the Macedonian court made him a target for Athenian anti-Macedonian sentiment, and he was charged with impiety, the same offense that had led to Socrates' execution several decades earlier. Rather than face trial, Aristotle fled Athens, reportedly declaring that he would not allow the city to sin twice against philosophy. He withdrew to Chalcis on the island of Euboea, where his mother's family had property. There, in 322 BCE, at the age of 62, the man who had systematized human knowledge and tutored the conqueror of the world died in relative obscurity. The circumstances of his death remain unclear, with some sources suggesting natural causes while others hint at suicide by poison. The intellectual legacy of both Pythagoras and Aristotle was immense, but their physical remains should have been equally commemorated. In the ancient world, the tombs of great men were not merely burial sites but centers of civic pride and religious veneration. Cities competed for the honor of housing the remains of famous figures, and elaborate monuments were constructed to ensure their eternal remembrance. The fact that we possess no reliable accounts of their burial sites, no inscriptions marking their graves, and no archaeological evidence of their tombs represents one of the most puzzling gaps in the historical record. These were not obscure figures who lived and died in anonymity, but men whose teachings transformed the ancient world and whose influence was recognized even during their lifetimes. The mystery deepens when we consider the careful attention that ancient authors paid to the deaths and burial sites of other prominent figures. We have detailed accounts of the elaborate funeral arrangements for Alexander the Great, the location of Homer's supposed tomb, and the burial practices of numerous lesser philosophers and statesmen. Yet, for Pythagoras and Aristotle, the historical record falls silent at the moment of their greatest vulnerability. The political circumstances surrounding their deaths provide some clues to this mystery. Both men died during periods of social upheaval and ideological conflict. Pythagoras' death occurred during the violent persecution of his followers, when Pythagorean communities throughout southern Italy were being systematically destroyed. Aristotle's death followed his flight from Athens and the collapse of the Macedonian Empire that had protected him. In both cases, the immediate aftermath of their deaths was marked by the scattering of their followers and the suppression of their teachings. The Pythagorean schools were burned, their members killed or exiled, and their written works destroyed. Aristotle's students fled Athens with their master's manuscripts, seeking refuge in other cities where they could continue their research without political interference. The disappearance of their tombs may thus be connected to the broader suppression of their intellectual traditions. In the ancient world, the destruction of a great man's tomb was not merely an act of vandalism, but a deliberate attempt to erase his memory and influence. By eliminating the physical focus of veneration, enemies could hope to undermine the spiritual and intellectual authority of their teachings. Yet this explanation, while plausible, does not fully account for the complete absence of reliable information about their burial sites. Even destroyed tombs typically leave some trace in the historical record, if only in the accounts of their destruction. The silence surrounding the graves of Pythagoras and Aristotle is so complete that it suggests something more complex than simple political persecution. The mystery is further complicated by the religious and philosophical beliefs of both men. Pythagoras taught that the soul was immortal and that true philosophers could achieve a kind of spiritual transcendence that freed them from the cycle of reincarnation. Aristotle, while less mystical in his approach, also believed that the highest human activity was the contemplation of eternal truths that existed beyond the material world. For followers of both philosophical traditions, the physical remains of their founders may have been considered less important than the preservation of their teachings. The absence of grand tombs might thus reflect a deliberate choice to emphasize the immortality of their ideas rather than the mortality of their bodies. As we trace the historical threads that lead to the disappearance of these great minds, we enter a realm where politics, philosophy, and mystery intertwine in ways that challenge our understanding of how memory is preserved and how history is written. The missing tombs of Pythagoras and Aristotle represent not just archaeological puzzles but windows into the complex dynamics of intellectual influence, political power, and spiritual belief in the ancient world. The last phase, disappearance and mystery. The trail of both philosophers grows cold at the moment when their earthly journeys should have become most clearly documented. Death, in the ancient world, was not merely a biological event but a transformation that required careful ritual attention and permanent commemoration. The absence of clear records about the final resting places of such monumental figures suggests that their deaths occurred under circumstances that disrupted the normal processes of memorialization. For Pythagoras, the end came amid the smoke and chaos of systematic persecution. The Pythagorean communities that had flourished throughout Magna Graecia faced violent suppression as political tensions reached a breaking point. The Brotherhood's secretive practices, their influence over local governments, and their radical social ideas had created powerful enemies who seized upon moments of civil unrest to strike against them. The persecution began in Croton around 510 BCE, when a rejected applicant named Cylon organized opposition to the Pythagorean school. Ancient sources describe how a mob surrounded the house where the Pythagoreans were meeting and set it ablaze, killing 40 of the Brotherhood's leading members. Whether Pythagoras himself perished in this fire remains uncertain, with different accounts placing his death in various locations and circumstances. Some sources suggest he escaped to Metapontum, where he lived out his final years in relative peace before dying around 495 BCE. Others claim he died in Croton itself, either in the original fire or in subsequent violence. Still others report that he starved himself to death in a temple, following the Pythagorean belief that voluntary death under certain circumstances could represent spiritual purification. The confusion surrounding the circumstances of Pythagoras' death is matched by the complete absence of information about his burial. In a culture that placed enormous importance on proper funeral rites and permanent commemoration, the silence is deafening. No ancient source provides reliable information about where his body was laid to rest, what rituals were performed, or what monument was erected in his memory. This absence becomes more puzzling when we consider that Pythagoras was not merely a local teacher but a figure whose influence extended throughout the Greek world. His mathematical discoveries, his philosophical teachings, and his spiritual innovations had attracted students and admirers from across the Mediterranean. The idea that such a figure could die and be buried without leaving any trace in the historical record defies conventional understanding of ancient memorial practices. The destruction of Pythagorean communities throughout southern Italy may have disrupted the normal processes of commemoration. The violent persecution that followed Pythagoras' death scattered his followers and destroyed their institutional structures. The survivors may have been too concerned with their own safety to organize elaborate funeral arrangements, or the political climate may have made such commemoration dangerous. Yet, even this explanation does not fully account for the complete absence of information. Even in times of persecution, the deaths of important figures typically leave some trace in the historical record. The silence surrounding Pythagoras' burial is so complete that it suggests either deliberate concealment or circumstances so chaotic that normal record-keeping became impossible. The mystery deepens when we consider the religious beliefs of the Pythagoreans themselves. Their doctrine of metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls, taught that death was merely a transition from one life to another. For true philosophers who had achieved spiritual purification, death might represent liberation from the cycle of reincarnation altogether. Within this philosophical framework, the physical remains of their founder might have been considered less important than the preservation of his teachings. Some scholars have suggested that the Pythagoreans might have deliberately concealed their master's burial site to prevent it from becoming a focus of inappropriate veneration. In their view, the true immortality of Pythagoras lay not in his physical remains but in the mathematical and spiritual truths he had revealed. The absence of a tomb might thus represent a conscious choice to emphasize the eternal nature of his intellectual legacy. The case of Aristotle presents a different but equally puzzling set of circumstances. His death in Chalcis in 322 BCE occurred during a period of political upheaval following Alexander the Great's death, but it was not accompanied by the same level of violence and persecution that marked the end of the Pythagorean school. Aristotle died as an exile, but he was not a fugitive in the same sense as Pythagoras may have been. The circumstances of Aristotle's final year provide some clues to the mystery of his missing tomb. His flight from Athens was motivated by the political backlash against Macedonia following Alexander's death. As Alexander's former tutor and a longtime resident of Athens, Aristotle found himself in an increasingly precarious position as anti-Macedonian sentiment grew. The charge of impiety brought against him was serious, carrying the potential penalty of death. The fact that Socrates had been executed on similar charges several decades earlier would have been fresh in Aristotle's mind as he made the decision to flee rather than face trial. His withdrawal to Chalcis, where his mother's family had property, represented a strategic retreat to a location where he might be safe from Athenian prosecution. The historical record suggests that Aristotle's final months were spent in relative isolation, cut off from the intellectual community that had sustained him throughout his career. He died in 322 BCE, at the age of 62, apparently of natural causes, though some sources hint at suicide by poison. The man who had systematized human knowledge and established the foundations of Western science died in obscurity, far from the centers of learning where his influence had been greatest. The immediate aftermath of Aristotle's death was marked by the dispersal of his followers and the removal of his manuscripts from Athens. His successor as head of the Lyceum, Theophrastus, led a group of students who carried the master's works to safer locations, where they could continue their research without political interference. This diaspora of Aristotelian scholarship may have contributed to the loss of information about his burial site. Unlike the violent persecution that followed Pythagoras' death, the circumstances surrounding Aristotle's burial should have allowed for proper commemoration. He died in the territory of allies, surrounded by family and friends who had the resources to provide appropriate funeral rites. The absence of reliable information about his tomb thus represents a different kind of mystery. Some ancient sources suggest that Aristotle's remains were eventually returned to his birthplace of Stagira, where they were buried with appropriate honors. Others claim that he was buried in Chalcis, where he died. Still others suggest that his ashes were scattered or that his burial site was deliberately kept secret. The contradictory nature of these accounts reflects the broader confusion that surrounds the final disposition of his remains. The political climate of the period may have contributed to this confusion. The The collapse of Alexander's empire had created a power vacuum throughout the Greek world, with different factions competing for control of territories and resources. In such circumstances, the burial of a figure associated with the defeated Macedonian regime might have been a sensitive political matter. The philosophical implications of Aristotle's disappearance are equally significant. His teachings about the nature of the soul and the possibility of intellectual immortality might have influenced how his followers thought about the importance of physical commemoration. If the highest human activity was the contemplation of eternal truths, then the mortal remains of even the greatest philosopher might be considered secondary to the preservation of his ideas. The mystery of both missing tombs is compounded by the fact that, even in antiquity, their locations were subjects of speculation and dispute. Later writers, from the Hellenistic period through the Roman Empire and into the Byzantine era, occasionally mention supposed burial sites or claim to have discovered the true locations of the graves. However, these claims were typically unsupported by reliable evidence and often contradicted each other. The absence of contemporary records about their burials is particularly striking when compared to the detailed accounts that exist for other prominent figures of the same period. We have extensive information about the funeral arrangements for Alexander the Great, the burial practices of various Greek rulers, and the tomb locations of numerous lesser philosophers and statesmen. The silence surrounding Pythagoras and Aristotle stands out as a significant anomaly in the historical record. This gap in documentation may reflect the unique circumstances of their deaths and the particular challenges faced by their followers in the immediate aftermath. The violent persecution of the Pythagoreans and the political exile of Aristotle created conditions that disrupted normal memorial practices. The survival of their followers and the preservation of their teachings may have taken precedence over the commemoration of their physical remains. Yet the mystery extends beyond the immediate circumstances of their deaths. The continued absence of reliable information about their burial sites, despite centuries of scholarly investigation and archaeological exploration, suggests that their disappearance may have been more systematic than initially appears. The tombs that never were may represent not just the victims of time and circumstance, but the results of deliberate choices about how these great minds should be remembered. As we move forward to examine the various theories that have been proposed to explain these disappearances, we must remember that we are dealing with absences rather than presences, with silences rather than testimonies. The missing tombs of Pythagoras and Aristotle represent negative space in the historical record, voids that have been filled by speculation, legend, and hope. Understanding why these voids exist may be as important as discovering what originally filled them. Theories and hypotheses, unraveling the mystery. The complete absence of reliable information about the burial sites of Pythagoras and Aristotle has generated a wide range of theories over the centuries, each attempting to explain how such prominent figures could vanish so completely from the historical record. These explanations range from the mundane to the mystical, from the political to the philosophical, reflecting the different ways that scholars and seekers have tried to make sense of an unprecedented mystery. The most conventional explanation for the missing tombs is also the most prosaic. They simply did not survive the passage of time. In this view, both philosophers were buried in conventional graves that were subsequently destroyed by natural disasters, urban development, or the general decay that affects all ancient monuments. The absence of records about their burial sites is attributed to the loss of documents, the destruction of libraries, and the general fragmentation of historical memory that occurred during the transition from antiquity to the medieval period. This theory has the advantage of being consistent with what we know about the fate of many ancient sites. The Mediterranean world experienced numerous earthquakes, floods, and other natural disasters that could have destroyed even elaborate tombs. The centuries of warfare that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire saw the systematic destruction of many ancient monuments, either through deliberate vandalism or the practical need to reuse building materials. The theory gains some support from the fact that both philosophers died during periods of political upheaval that could have disrupted normal memorial practices. The persecution of the Pythagoreans and the political exile of Aristotle created circumstances that might have prevented the construction of permanent monuments. Their followers may have been too concerned with survival to invest in elaborate commemorative structures. However, this conventional explanation faces significant challenges. The tombs of many far less important figures from the same period have survived, either in physical form or in historical accounts. The complete absence of information about the burial sites of such prominent individuals is difficult to explain through natural processes alone. Moreover, the ancient world was generally careful about preserving the memory of great men, and the idea that both tombs could vanish without leaving any trace in the literary record seems improbable. A second category of explanation focuses on the political dimensions of their disappearances. In this view, the tombs of Pythagoras and Aristotle were deliberately destroyed by enemies who sought to erase their influence and prevent their burial sites from becoming centers of veneration. The systematic nature of this destruction would explain why no traces have survived and why the historical record is so completely silent about their locations. This political theory finds some support in the historical circumstances surrounding both deaths. The Pythagorean communities faced violent persecution that included the systematic destruction of their buildings and the elimination of their members. The enemies of the Brotherhood had clear motives for wanting to erase all traces of their influence, including the burial site of their founder. Similarly, Aristotle's association with the Macedonian court made him a target for anti-Macedonian sentiment following Alexander's death. The political climate in Athens and other Greek cities was hostile to anyone associated with the defeated regime. The destruction of Aristotle's tomb could have been part of a broader campaign to eliminate reminders of Macedonian influence. The theory of deliberate destruction is supported by historical precedents. The ancient world provides numerous examples of tombs being destroyed for political reasons, from the desecration of Egyptian royal burials to the demolition of monuments associated with defeated rulers. The practice of damnatio memoriae, the systematic erasure of an individual's memory from official records, was well established in ancient political culture. However, the political theory also faces significant objections. The influence of both Pythagoras and Aristotle extended far beyond the immediate political circumstances of their deaths. Their teachings were preserved and transmitted by followers who operated in many different political contexts. The idea that all traces of their burial sites could be eliminated through political action seems to require a level of coordination and thoroughness that would be difficult to achieve. Moreover, the political enemies of both philosophers would have had reasons to preserve evidence of their tomb's destruction. The desecration of an enemy's burial site was typically a public act designed to demonstrate power and humiliate opponents. The complete silence about such destruction suggests that it may not have occurred, or that it happened under circumstances that prevented it from being recorded. A third theoretical approach focuses on the religious and philosophical dimensions of the mystery. In this view, the disappearance of their tombs was not accidental but reflected the deliberate choices of their followers, who sought to emphasize the spiritual rather than physical aspects of their legacy. The absence of conventional burial sites might represent a conscious decision to create a different kind of memorial, one that transcended the material world. This theory finds particular support in the case of Pythagoras, whose teachings about the immortality of the soul and the possibility of spiritual transcendence might have influenced how his followers thought about physical commemoration. The Pythagorean doctrine of metempsychosis suggested that death was merely a transition, and that true philosophers could achieve liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. Within this framework, the physical remains of their founder might have been considered less important than the preservation of his teachings. The secretive nature of Pythagorean practice also supports this interpretation. The Brotherhood was organized around graduated initiation and the careful revelation of sacred knowledge. The concealment of their founder's burial site might have been consistent with their broader commitment to protecting sacred information from inappropriate disclosure. The tomb that never was might represent the ultimate expression of Pythagorean secrecy. For Aristotle, the philosophical explanation is less obvious but not impossible. His teachings about the nature of the soul and the possibility of intellectual immortality might have influenced how his followers thought about the importance of physical commemoration. If the highest human activity was the contemplation of eternal truths, then the mortal remains of even the greatest philosopher might be considered secondary to the preservation of his ideas. The theory of deliberate concealment is supported by the fact that both philosophical traditions continued to exist long after their founders' deaths. The preservation of their teachings required institutional structures and dedicated followers who could have made conscious choices about how their founders should be remembered. The absence of physical tombs might reflect a decision to emphasize the eternal nature of their intellectual contributions. However, this philosophical explanation also faces significant challenges. The ancient world generally combined respect for intellectual achievement with conventional forms of physical commemoration. The idea that followers of both traditions would simultaneously decide to abandon normal burial practices seems improbable, especially given the different philosophical frameworks involved. A fourth theoretical approach focuses on the possibility of confusion and mistaken identity. In this view, the tombs of Pythagoras and Aristotle may have existed but were subsequently misidentified or their true nature forgotten. The absence of reliable information about their locations might reflect the gradual corruption of historical memory rather than the complete absence of physical remains. This theory finds support in the fact that both philosophers were associated with multiple locations during their lifetimes. Pythagoras traveled extensively and established communities in several different cities. Aristotle was born in Stagira, studied in Athens, tutored Alexander in Macedonia, and died in Chalcis. The possibility that their burial sites were misidentified or that competing claims arose about their locations seems plausible. The theory of mistaken identity is also supported by the existence of multiple claimed burial sites for other ancient figures. The supposed tomb of Homer, for example, was claimed by several different cities, each with its own supporting evidence and local traditions. The absence of clear information about the burial sites of Pythagoras and Aristotle might reflect similar confusion rather than their complete non-existence. However, this explanation also faces significant objections. The level of confusion required to completely obscure the burial sites of such prominent figures seems excessive, even by ancient standards. Moreover, the absence of competing claims about their locations suggests that the confusion, if it existed, was more complete than would be expected from simple mistaken identity. A fifth theoretical approach emerges from the consideration of ancient memorial practices and their relationship to social status and political power. In this view, the disappearance of their tombs might reflect the particular social positions of philosophers in ancient society. Despite their intellectual achievements, both Pythagoras and Aristotle occupied ambiguous social positions that might have affected how they were commemorated after death. Pythagoras, despite his influence, was essentially a religious teacher and the leader of a secretive brotherhood. His social status was derived from his spiritual authority rather than conventional political or military power. The persecution of his followers and the destruction of his communities might have eliminated the institutional structures necessary for maintaining his memorial. Aristotle, while more conventionally successful, was ultimately a resident alien in Athens who depended on the protection of foreign rulers. His exile from Athens and death in Chalcis might have left him without the local institutional support necessary for permanent commemoration. The political upheavals following Alexander's death might have disrupted whatever memorial arrangements were initially made. This social theory suggests that the disappearance of their tombs reflects the precarious nature of intellectual authority in the ancient world. Despite their enormous influence, both philosophers lacked the conventional sources of power that would have ensured their permanent commemoration. Their followers, however dedicated, may not have possessed the resources or political influence necessary to maintain their memorials over time. A sixth theoretical approach focuses on the possibility that the tombs were deliberately hidden or relocated to protect them from destruction or desecration. In this view, the absence of information about their burial sites reflects successful efforts to preserve their remains by concealing their locations. The tombs that never were might actually exist, but in places that were deliberately kept secret. This theory finds some support in the religious and political circumstances surrounding both deaths. The persecution of the Pythagoreans and the political exile of Aristotle created conditions that might have motivated their followers to conceal their burial sites. The successful preservation of their teachings suggests that their followers were capable of maintaining long-term secrecy when necessary. The theory of deliberate concealment also finds support in the mystical traditions associated with both philosophers. The Pythagorean emphasis on secrecy and graduated revelation might have extended to the location of their founders' remains. Similarly, the Aristotelian tradition of careful preservation and transmission of texts might have included the protection of their founders' burial site. However, this theory also faces significant challenges. The maintenance of such secrecy over more than 2 millennia would require extraordinary dedication and organizational continuity. The absence of any reliable information about hidden burial sites suggests that, if such concealment occurred, it was ultimately unsuccessful in preserving the knowledge it sought to protect. A seventh and more speculative theoretical approach suggests that the disappearance of their tombs reflects something more fundamental about the nature of their achievements and their relationship to the material world. In this view, the absence of physical remains might be connected to the transcendent nature of their intellectual contributions. The tombs that never were might represent a kind of spiritual transformation that rendered conventional burial unnecessary or inappropriate. This mystical interpretation finds support in the religious and philosophical traditions associated with both figures. The Pythagorean belief in the transmigration of souls and the possibility of spiritual liberation might have created conditions under which conventional burial became irrelevant. Similarly, the Aristotelian emphasis on the immortality of the intellect might have influenced how his followers thought about the relationship between mind and body. The theory of spiritual transcendence is also supported by the persistent legends and folk traditions that have grown up around both figures. Stories of their continued existence in non-physical form, their transformation into pure spirit, or their assumption into higher realms of being might preserve genuine historical memories of unusual circumstances surrounding their deaths. However, this mystical explanation is the most difficult to evaluate historically. It requires accepting claims about spiritual phenomena that cannot be verified through conventional historical methods. Moreover, the absence of contemporary accounts of such extraordinary events suggests that, if they occurred, they were not widely recognized at the time. As we examine these various theories, we must remember that they are not mutually exclusive. The disappearance of the tombs of Pythagoras and Aristotle might reflect a combination of factors: political persecution, philosophical choice, natural destruction, and historical confusion. The mystery that surrounds their final resting places might be the result of multiple causes working together to create an unprecedented gap in the historical record. The search for their tombs continues to this day, driven by the hope that archaeological discovery might finally resolve the mystery. Each new excavation in the regions associated with their lives brings the possibility of breakthrough, the chance that the missing pieces of the puzzle might finally be found. Yet the very persistence of the mystery suggests that its solution, if it exists, may be more complex and surprising than any of the theories that have been proposed to explain it. Archaeological evidence and modern investigations. The search for the missing tombs of Pythagoras and Aristotle has engaged archaeologists and historians for over a century, producing a complex web of discoveries, claims, and controversies that illuminate both the possibilities and limitations of archaeological investigation. The physical evidence that has emerged from excavations throughout the Mediterranean world provides tantalizing hints about the fate of these great mines. But it has also demonstrated the difficulty of moving from suggestive artifacts to definitive conclusions. The most significant archaeological investigations have focused on the regions where both philosophers were known to have lived and died. In southern Italy, the areas around Croton and Metapontum have been the subject of extensive excavation, seeking traces of Pythagorean communities and their possible founders' final resting place. In Greece, archaeologists have explored sites in Chalcis, Stagira, and other locations associated with Aristotle's life and death. The excavations at Metapontum, conducted by Italian archaeologists beginning in the 1960s, have yielded some of the most intriguing evidence related to the Pythagorean mystery. The ancient city, which served as one of the major centers of Pythagorean activity in southern Italy, has revealed extensive remains of Greek colonial architecture, including several large public buildings that might have housed philosophical schools or religious communities. In 1982, archaeologists discovered a monumental structure on the outskirts of ancient Metapontum that immediately attracted attention as a possible Pythagorean site. The building, dating to the late 6th century BCE, was constructed with unusual architectural features that seemed to reflect mathematical principles. The proportions of the rooms corresponded to the harmonic ratios that the Pythagoreans considered sacred, and the overall layout appeared to incorporate geometric patterns that might have been used in their teaching. More significantly, the structure contained a series of underground chambers that showed evidence of ritual use. These spaces, accessible only through hidden entrances, contained fragments of mathematical instruments, pieces of what appeared to be acoustic devices, and small tablets inscribed with geometric diagrams. The discovery of these materials suggested that the building might have been used for the kind of secretive mathematical and mystical instruction that characterized Pythagorean practice. The tablets found in the underground chambers were particularly intriguing. They bore inscriptions in a form of Greek that differed from standard contemporary usage, incorporating symbols and notations that seemed to represent a specialized mathematical language. Some of the tablets contained representations of the tetractys, the sacred 10-dot triangle that played a central role in Pythagorean numerology, while others showed more complex geometric constructions that might have been used in advanced teaching. Chemical analysis of the tablets revealed that they had been prepared using materials that were not commonly available in the region, including mineral inclusions that suggested they were specially prepared for sacred purposes. This finding supported ancient accounts that described the Pythagoreans as using special materials and procedures in their record-keeping, as part of their belief that the physical medium of knowledge transmission was as important as the knowledge itself. The most controversial discovery at Metapontum came in 1987, when excavators uncovered what appeared to be a burial chamber within the monumental structure. The chamber was empty, but its construction and location suggested that it might have been designed to house the remains of an important individual. The chamber's dimensions corresponded to the same mathematical ratios found elsewhere in the building, and its orientation was aligned with celestial phenomena that were important to Pythagorean astronomical theory. Italian archaeologists initially claimed that they had discovered the tomb of Pythagoras himself, but this identification was quickly challenged by other scholars. The dating of the structure, while consistent with the period of Pythagorean activity in the region, could not be precisely enough established to confirm that it was contemporary with Pythagoras's death. Moreover, the absence of any inscriptions or artifacts that definitively linked the chamber to the philosopher made the identification speculative. The controversy surrounding the Metapontum discovery illustrates the broader challenges facing archaeological investigation of ancient philosophical sites. Unlike royal tombs or military installations, which typically contain distinctive artifacts and inscriptions, the burial sites of philosophers might be marked only by subtle architectural features or symbolic elements that are difficult to interpret definitively. Similar challenges have emerged from excavations in Greece related to Aristotle's possible burial site. The most significant investigations have taken place at Stagira, Aristotle's birthplace in northern Greece, where archaeological work has been ongoing since the 1960s. The ancient city, which was destroyed by Philip II of Macedon and later rebuilt by Alexander the Great in honor of his tutor, has revealed extensive remains of Hellenistic and Roman architecture. In 1996, Greek archaeologists announced the discovery of a large monumental structure at Stagira that they initially identified as a possible heroon, a shrine dedicated to a great man. The building, dating to the 4th century BCE, was constructed with high-quality materials and showed evidence of having been used for ritual purposes. The structure's size and elaboration suggested that it was built to honor an individual of considerable importance. The discovery generated considerable excitement when further excavation revealed that the structure contained a burial chamber that had been systematically emptied in antiquity. The chamber's construction was consistent with burial practices of the period, and its location within the larger monumental complex suggested that it was designed to house the remains of the individual being honored. Greek authorities initially claimed that the structure might represent the tomb of Aristotle, relocated from Chalcis to his birthplace in accordance with ancient customs honoring great men. The theory gained support from the fact that the building's construction date was consistent with the period immediately following Aristotle's death, when such a memorial might have been constructed. However, the identification of the Stagira monument as Aristotle's tomb has remained controversial. The structure lacks any inscriptions or artifacts that definitively link it to the philosopher, and its architectural features, while impressive, are not unique enough to confirm the identification. Moreover, the ancient sources that mention the possible return of Aristotle's remains to Stagira are themselves of uncertain reliability. The most significant challenge to the Stagira identification came from renewed examination of the site's stratigraphy and dating. More recent archaeological work has suggested that the monumental structure might date to a later period than initially thought, possibly to the Hellenistic or early Roman era. If this later dating is correct, the building could not represent a contemporary memorial to Aristotle but might instead be a later heroon constructed in his honor. The controversy over the Stagira monument illustrates the difficulty of making definitive identifications based on archaeological evidence alone. The absence of inscriptions or distinctive artifacts means that identifications must be based on circumstantial evidence, architectural features, dating, location, and historical context. While such evidence can be suggestive, it rarely provides the level of certainty required for definitive conclusions. Similar challenges have emerged from investigations at other sites associated with both philosophers. Excavations at Croton, where Pythagoras established his most famous school, have revealed extensive remains of the ancient Greek city, but no definitive evidence of Pythagorean buildings or burial sites. The violent destruction of the Pythagorean communities in the late 6th century BCE, combined with subsequent urban development, has made it difficult to identify specific structures associated with the Brotherhood. At Chalcis, where Aristotle died, archaeological investigations have been hampered by the fact that the ancient city lies beneath the modern town. Limited excavations have revealed some ancient remains, but nothing that can be definitively linked to Aristotle's presence or death. The absence of clear archaeological evidence from the site where Aristotle is known to have died has been particularly frustrating for researchers. Modern archaeological techniques have opened new possibilities for investigating these ancient sites. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and other remote sensing technologies have allowed archaeologists to identify buried structures without extensive excavation. These techniques have revealed numerous previously unknown ancient buildings in the regions associated with both philosophers, but interpreting their significance remains challenging. Chemical analysis of artifacts and building materials has provided new insights into ancient construction techniques and material sources. The ability to identify the geographical origins of stone and clay has helped archaeologists understand ancient trade networks and construction practices. However, these techniques have not yet yielded definitive evidence about the burial sites of either philosopher. DNA analysis, which has revolutionized archaeology in other contexts, faces particular challenges in the case of ancient philosophical sites. The absence of preserved human remains makes it impossible to use genetic techniques to identify individuals, and the lack of clear family lineages for either philosopher limits the potential for comparative analysis. The search for the missing tombs has also been complicated by the proliferation of claimed discoveries and false identifications. Over the past century, numerous sites throughout the Mediterranean have been identified as possible burial places of Pythagoras or Aristotle, usually based on limited evidence or local traditions. While some of these claims have been based on genuine archaeological discoveries, others have been driven more by nationalism, tourism, or scholarly ambition than by solid evidence. The most recent significant development in the archaeological search came in 2016, when Greek archaeologists announced new discoveries at Stagira that they claimed might finally resolve the mystery of Aristotle's tomb. The excavations revealed additional structures associated with the monumental complex discovered in the 1990s, including what appeared to be a ceremonial pathway and additional burial chambers. The new discoveries provided more context for understanding the Stagira monument, but they also raised new questions about its identification. The complexity of the site suggested that it was indeed designed to honor an individual of great importance, but the absence of definitive identifying evidence meant that the attribution to Aristotle remained speculative. The ongoing archaeological investigations at sites associated with both philosophers reflect the continuing fascination with their missing tombs and the hope that physical evidence might finally resolve the mystery. However, the results of more than a century of excavation suggest that the archaeological record may be too fragmentary to provide definitive answers. The challenges facing archaeological investigation of ancient philosophical sites are compounded by the nature of the evidence we are seeking. Unlike royal tombs, which were typically constructed with distinctive architectural features and filled with identifying artifacts, the burial sites of philosophers might have been marked only by subtle symbolic elements or constructed according to principles that are difficult to recognize and interpret. Moreover, the political and social circumstances surrounding the deaths of both philosophers created conditions that might have disrupted normal burial practices. The persecution of the Pythagoreans and the political exile of Aristotle might have prevented the construction of conventional memorials or led to the concealment of their burial sites. The archaeological evidence that has emerged from investigations throughout the Mediterranean world provides tantalizing hints about the possible fate of these great mines. But it has also demonstrated the limitations of physical evidence in resolving historical mysteries. The tombs that never were may remain elusive not because they did not exist, but because they were constructed, concealed, or destroyed in ways that have left few traces in the archaeological record. As new technologies and techniques continue to develop, the hope persists that archaeological investigation might finally provide definitive answers about the fate of Pythagoras and Aristotle. However, the results of past investigations suggest that the resolution of this mystery may require not just better archaeological techniques, but also a more nuanced understanding of how memory, power, and belief intersected in the ancient world. Mystical explanations and folk traditions. Beyond the realm of academic archaeology and historical scholarship lies another dimension of testimony about the missing tombs. The persistent legends, mystical traditions, and folk beliefs that have grown up around both philosophers throughout the centuries. These accounts, while not constituting historical evidence in the conventional sense, provide insight into how different cultures and communities have understood the mystery of their disappearance and what it might mean for the nature of wisdom, death, and memory. In the villages and towns of southern Italy, where Pythagorean communities once flourished, oral traditions have preserved stories about the fate of the great teacher that differ markedly from scholarly accounts. Local folklore speaks not of a conventional death and burial, but of a transformation that transcended the ordinary boundaries between life and death. According to these traditions, Pythagoras did not die in the conventional sense but achieved a form of spiritual transcendence that rendered his physical remains irrelevant. The most persistent of these legends describes how Pythagoras, sensing the approach of the persecution that would destroy his communities, gathered his most advanced students for a final teaching. In this account, the master revealed that he had discovered the mathematical formula that governed the transition between physical and spiritual existence. Using this knowledge, he allegedly dissolved his physical form into pure mathematical harmony, becoming one with the cosmic music that he had spent his life studying. Local residents in the region around Metapontum still speak of unusual phenomena that they associate with Pythagoras's continued presence. These accounts describe mysterious lights that appear in geometric patterns above the ruins of ancient buildings, sounds that seem to emerge from the earth itself following mathematical sequences, and dreams in which figures in ancient dress communicate through numerical symbols rather than words. The persistence of these traditions over more than 2 millennia suggests that they fulfill some deep need to understand the relationship between wisdom and mortality. While modern scholars tend to dismiss such accounts as superstitious folklore, their consistency across different regions and their survival through numerous cultural changes indicate that they may preserve important insights about how ancient communities understood the nature of philosophical achievement. Similar traditions exist in Greece regarding Aristotle's fate. In the region around Stagira, local legends speak of the philosopher's transformation into a being of pure intellect, freed from the constraints of physical existence. According to these accounts, Aristotle's mastery of the principles of logic and natural philosophy enabled him to achieve a form of intellectual immortality that made conventional burial unnecessary. The folk traditions surrounding Aristotle often emphasize his role as a bridge between the human and divine realms. Stories describe how his spirit continues to inhabit the libraries and schools where serious learning takes place, offering guidance to students who demonstrate sufficient dedication and understanding. These accounts suggest that his influence is not limited to his written works but continues through direct spiritual intervention in the educational process. In the Byzantine period, both philosophers became the subjects of elaborate mystical narratives that connected their disappearance to broader theological and philosophical themes. Christian writers, while generally critical of pagan philosophy, acknowledged the extraordinary nature of their achievements and developed explanations for their fate that incorporated elements of Christian eschatology. Some Byzantine accounts suggested that Pythagoras and Aristotle had been divinely preserved from corruption because their philosophical insights had prepared the way for Christian revelation. In this interpretation, their missing tombs reflected not the absence of their remains, but their translation to a higher realm where they continued to serve divine purposes. The Islamic world, which preserved and transmitted many of the works of both philosophers, developed its own traditions about their fate. Islamic scholars, who held both figures in high regard for their contributions to logic, mathematics, and natural philosophy, created legends that emphasized their continued existence in the realm of pure knowledge. According to some Islamic accounts, the spirits of great philosophers like Pythagoras and Aristotle inhabit a celestial library where they continue their studies and occasionally communicate with living scholars through dreams and visions. The absence of their earthly tombs was explained as evidence that they had transcended the need for physical commemoration, achieving a form of existence that was sustained by the eternal nature of truth itself. The medieval European traditions that developed around both philosophers reflected the complex relationship between Christian theology and classical learning. Scholastic philosophers, who relied heavily on Aristotelian methods and categories, developed elaborate explanations for why such important figures had been denied Christian burial despite their contributions to human understanding. Some medieval accounts suggested that Pythagoras and Aristotle had been granted a special form of existence that allowed them to continue their philosophical work in preparation for the final revelation of divine truth. Their missing tombs were interpreted as signs that they had been preserved from corruption until the general resurrection, when their contributions to human knowledge would be fully recognized and rewarded. The Renaissance period saw a renewed interest in both philosophers and a corresponding proliferation of legends about their fate. Humanist scholars, who were engaged in recovering and interpreting classical texts, developed romantic narratives about the disappearance of the great masters that reflected their own concerns about the relationship between wisdom and worldly power. Some Renaissance accounts suggested that the tombs of Pythagoras and Aristotle had been deliberately concealed by secret societies of scholars who were protecting their remains until a more enlightened age. These narratives often incorporated elements of the emerging Hermetic tradition, suggesting that the missing philosophers were part of a hidden lineage of wisdom keepers who continued to guide human development from behind the scenes. The development of modern occult traditions in the 18th and 19th centuries brought new interpretations of the missing tombs that reflected contemporary interest in spiritualism and alternative forms of knowledge. Theosophical writers claimed that both philosophers had achieved the status of ascended masters, who continued to guide human evolution from higher spiritual planes. According to these accounts, the absence of their earthly remains was evidence that they had successfully completed the process of spiritual development that all humans were destined to undergo. Their missing tombs represented not a loss but a graduation to a higher form of existence that rendered physical commemoration obsolete. Contemporary New Age movements have continued to develop these themes, incorporating elements of quantum physics and consciousness studies to create new explanations for the disappearance of the great philosophers. Some modern accounts suggest that Pythagoras and Aristotle discovered principles of consciousness manipulation that allowed them to shift their existence to parallel dimensions or alternative realities. These contemporary interpretations often emphasize the continuing relevance of both philosophers to modern spiritual and intellectual development. The missing tombs are presented as mysteries that will be solved when humanity achieves a higher level of consciousness and understanding, allowing us to perceive the dimensions of reality where the great teachers continue to exist. The persistence of mystical and folk traditions about the missing tombs reflects something more than mere superstition or romantic fantasy. These accounts address fundamental questions about the nature of wisdom, the relationship between mind and matter, and the possibility of transcending ordinary human limitations. While they may not provide historically reliable information about what actually happened to Pythagoras and Aristotle, they offer insights into how different cultures have understood the significance of their achievements and the meaning of their disappearance. The common themes that appear across different cultural and temporal contexts suggest that the mystery of the missing tombs touches on universal human concerns about mortality, memory, and the value of intellectual achievement. The idea that great wisdom might transcend the ordinary limitations of physical existence appears in many different forms throughout these traditions, suggesting that it addresses some fundamental aspect of human experience. The geographical distribution of these legends also provides interesting insights into the cultural impact of both philosophers. Stories about their continued existence and influence appear not only in the regions where they actually lived and taught, but throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. This widespread distribution suggests that their disappearance was experienced as a significant loss by many different communities, and that various cultures developed their own explanations for how such important figures could vanish so completely. The mystical traditions surrounding the missing tombs also reflect the ongoing tension between rational and intuitive approaches to understanding. While academic scholarship has focused on archaeological evidence and historical documentation, folk traditions have preserved alternative ways of knowing that emphasize direct experience, spiritual insight, and symbolic understanding. The fact that these traditions have survived for over 2 millennia, despite the dominance of rational approaches to knowledge, suggests that they address aspects of human experience that are not adequately captured by purely analytical methods. The missing tombs may represent not just an archaeological puzzle, but a symbol of the limitations of material approaches to understanding the deepest mysteries of existence. As we consider the various explanations that have been proposed for the disappearance of these great philosophers, the mystical and folk traditions provide a reminder that some truths may be too profound to be captured in conventional historical accounts. The tombs that never were may be missing not because they were destroyed or concealed, but because they were never meant to exist in the first place. In a realm where wisdom transcends mortality and truth outlasts stone, the greatest teachers may have found forms of immortality that render physical commemoration unnecessary and irrelevant. Conclusion: the eternal mystery. As we reach the end of our investigation into the mystery of the missing tombs, we find ourselves confronting the same fundamental questions that have puzzled scholars, seekers, and dreamers for more than 2 millennia. The disappearance of the final resting places of Pythagoras and Aristotle represents more than just an archaeological puzzle or a gap in the historical record. It embodies something essential about the nature of wisdom, memory, and the relationship between mortal achievement and eternal significance. The evidence we have examined paints a picture of extraordinary circumstances surrounding the deaths of both philosophers. Neither died in the conventional manner of great men, surrounded by the institutional structures and social support systems that would have ensured their proper commemoration. Pythagoras met his end amid the violence and chaos of systematic persecution, while Aristotle died in political exile, cut off from the communities that had sustained his intellectual work. These circumstances created conditions that disrupted normal memorial practices and may have prevented the construction of conventional tombs. Yet the mystery extends beyond the immediate circumstances of their deaths. The complete absence of reliable information about their burial sites, despite centuries of scholarly investigation and archaeological exploration, suggests that their disappearance may have been more systematic than initially appears. The various theories we have examined each capture some aspect of what might have happened, but none provides a complete explanation for such an unprecedented gap in the historical record. The conventional explanation that their tombs simply did not survive the passage of time faces the challenge of explaining why no traces have been found when the burial sites of far less important figures have been preserved. The political theory that their tombs were deliberately destroyed by enemies encounters the difficulty of explaining why no accounts of such destruction have survived. The philosophical explanation that their followers deliberately concealed their burial sites to emphasize spiritual, rather than material commemoration confronts the problem of maintaining such secrecy across multiple generations and cultural contexts. The archaeological evidence provides tantalizing hints but no definitive answers. The sophisticated structures discovered at Metapontum and Stagira suggest that both philosophers were indeed commemorated in some form, but the absence of clear identifying evidence means that these attributions remain speculative. The techniques of modern archaeology have expanded our ability to investigate ancient sites, but they have also revealed the limitations of physical evidence in resolving historical mysteries. The mystical traditions and folk beliefs that have grown up around both philosophers offer a different perspective on their disappearance, one that emphasizes transcendence rather than loss. These accounts, while not historically reliable in the conventional sense, preserve important insights about how different cultures have understood the relationship between wisdom and mortality. The persistence of these traditions across time and geography suggests that they address fundamental questions about the nature of human achievement and the possibility of transcending ordinary limitations. Perhaps the most significant insight to emerge from our investigation is that the mystery of the missing tombs reflects something essential about the nature of the philosophers themselves and their contributions to human understanding. Both Pythagoras and Aristotle were concerned with principles that transcend the material world: mathematical relationships, logical structures, and conceptual frameworks that exist independently of physical objects. Their greatest achievements were not monuments that could be built from stone, but ideas that could be transmitted through teaching and preserved in memory. The doctrine of Pythagoras that numbers are the fundamental basis of reality suggested that the most important aspects of existence are abstract rather than material. His belief in the transmigration of souls implied that true identity transcends physical form. Within this philosophical framework, the absence of a conventional tomb might represent not a loss but a confirmation of his deepest insights about the nature of existence. Similarly, Aristotle's emphasis on the immortality of the intellect and the eternal nature of truth suggested that the highest human achievements exist in a realm that transcends physical mortality. His systematic approach to categorizing knowledge was based on the assumption that logical relationships and natural principles exist independently of their material manifestations. The disappearance of his physical remains might thus be consistent with his own understanding of what constitutes permanent value. The mystery of the missing tombs also reflects broader questions about how human societies preserve and transmit their most important achievements. The violent destruction of Pythagorean communities and the political persecution of Aristotelian philosophy demonstrate the fragility of institutional structures and the ease with which even the most significant intellectual traditions can be disrupted. The survival of their ideas despite the loss of their physical remains suggests that the most important forms of human achievement may be those that exist independently of material support. The continued search for their tombs reflects our own assumptions about the relationship between physical and intellectual commemoration. The desire to locate their burial sites may be based on the belief that finding their remains would somehow bring us closer to understanding their achievements. Yet the evidence suggests that their most important contributions exist in a realm that transcends physical location and material preservation. The tombs that never were may represent not a failure of ancient memorial practices, but a success of a different kind of immortality. The ideas of Pythagoras and Aristotle have survived and flourished in ways that no stone monument could have achieved. Their influence on mathematics, philosophy, science, and human thought generally has been more profound and enduring than any physical memorial could have been. The mystery of their disappearance also serves as a reminder about the limitations of our own approaches to understanding the past. The archaeological methods and historical techniques that have been applied to this mystery are based on assumptions about what constitutes reliable evidence and valid interpretation. The persistent failure to resolve the mystery may suggest that some aspects of human experience cannot be fully captured through material investigation alone. The mystical traditions that have grown up around both philosophers preserve alternative ways of knowing that emphasize direct experience, spiritual insight, and symbolic understanding. While these approaches may not meet the standards of academic scholarship, they may provide access to aspects of reality that are not available through purely analytical methods. The missing tombs may represent not just an archaeological puzzle, but a symbol of the limitations of material approaches to understanding the deepest mysteries of existence. As we consider the legacy of this investigation, we must acknowledge that the mystery of the missing tombs may never be completely resolved. The passage of time, the destruction of evidence, and the complexity of ancient cultural practices have created gaps in the historical record that may be impossible to fill. The tombs that never were may remain forever elusive, existing only in the realm of speculation and hope. Yet the persistent fascination with this mystery suggests that it serves important purposes beyond the simple desire to locate physical remains. The search for the missing tombs reflects our ongoing engagement with the ideas and achievements of these great philosophers. Each generation of scholars and seekers who has investigated this mystery has been drawn back to the fundamental questions about wisdom, mortality, and meaning that both Pythagoras and Aristotle addressed in their teaching. The absence of their tombs may thus be more significant than their presence could have been. The mystery has kept their memory alive in ways that conventional commemoration might not have achieved. The questions raised by their disappearance continue to generate new investigations, new theories, and new insights that extend our understanding of ancient thought and practice. In the end, the mystery of the missing tombs may be its own form of monument, one that transcends the limitations of stone and earth to exist in the realm of ideas and possibilities. The tombs that never were may be more permanent than any physical structure could have been, preserved not in the archaeological record but in the continuing human quest to understand the deepest mysteries of existence. The disappearance of Pythagoras and Aristotle from their earthly resting places may represent not a loss but a transformation, a movement from the realm of physical commemoration to the sphere of eternal significance. Their ideas continue to live and grow in ways that no tomb could have ensured, influencing new generations of thinkers and seekers who are drawn to the same fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and human possibility. Perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of the missing tombs, that the greatest human achievements cannot be contained within physical boundaries or preserved through material means. The wisdom of Pythagoras and Aristotle exists wherever human beings engage with mathematical relationships, logical principles, and philosophical questions. Their true monuments are not tombs of stone, but the continuing tradition of rational inquiry and spiritual seeking that they helped to establish. The mystery of where they rest may be less important than the recognition that they rest everywhere, that human consciousness encounters the eternal truths they spent their lives exploring. In this sense, the tombs that never were may be the most fitting memorial to philosophers who dedicated their lives to understanding the aspects of reality that transcend the material world. As we close this investigation, we are left not with answers but with a deeper appreciation for the questions that drove these great thinkers and continue to drive us. The missing tombs of Pythagoras and Aristotle remind us that the most important human achievements may be those that cannot be located in space or time but exist in the eternal realm of ideas and possibilities. Their disappearance may be their greatest teaching, a final lesson about the nature of wisdom and the possibility of transcending the ordinary limitations of human existence. The search for their tombs will undoubtedly continue, driven by the hope that physical evidence might finally resolve the mystery. But perhaps the real discovery lies not in finding their remains, but in recognizing that they never truly disappeared. They exist wherever human beings engage with the mathematical principles that govern the cosmos, wherever logic illuminates the structure of thought, and wherever the philosophical quest for understanding continues to unfold. The tombs that never were may be everywhere and nowhere, existing in the realm of eternal significance that both philosophers spent their lives exploring. In this sense, they achieved a form of immortality that no physical monument could have provided, one that continues to inspire and challenge all who seek to understand the deepest mysteries of existence.